Welcome to the channel.
My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old. I restore rare books for a living. And last Christmas, my father stood at the head of my dinner table, lifted his glass like he was about to make a toast, and instead said, "We're not babysitting your kids anymore." The whole room went still. Then he added louder, almost proud of himself, "And no more repairs either. I'm done fixing every little mess you create." I remember staring at him with my fork still in my hand, my son frozen beside me, my daughter halfway through reaching for a dinner roll, my mother looking down like she had known this was coming, and my sister giving me that tight little smile people use when they want front row seats to someone else's humiliation. I asked one word. "Seriously?" My father shrugged and said, "You've been leaning on family for too long. Maybe this is how you finally learn." What none of them seemed to understand was that babysitting twice a month and replacing a faucet they broke 3 Thanksgivings ago was not what had been keeping that family afloat. But I didn't say that there. I stood up, took my kids' coats, and told my father if he was done pretending generosity was the same thing as control, then I was done letting him perform at my expense. I walked out before the pie hit the table. By the next morning, my phone was exploding with 36 missed calls, and before that day was over, one comment from me would crack open every lie they had been hiding behind for years. Before I tell you what he said after I stood up, and what happened when I stopped protecting them, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I want to see how far this story reaches. Up until that Christmas, my family had spent years acting like I was the dependent one, which would have been funny if it hadn't cost me so much money, energy, and peace. My father, Walter Bennett, was a retired contractor who treated every favor like a lifetime investment in obedience. My mother, Diane, collected sympathy the way some people collect ornaments, and my younger sister, Megan Foster, had perfected the art of standing close enough to the mess to enjoy it without ever getting blamed for helping create it. Meanwhile, I was the one actually doing the boring adult work nobody wanted to acknowledge. I ran a book restoration and letterpress studio out of a narrow old townhouse in Providence, and because custom archival work can be feast or famine, I built my life carefully. No waste, no flashy spending, no pretending. I had 2 kids, Noah and Elsie, and after my divorce, I learned exactly how expensive dignity could be. So I worked. I restored 19th century family Bibles for strangers who respected me more than my own blood did. I rebound first editions, repaired water-damaged journals, designed wedding suites on antique presses, and stayed up late packing orders after the kids went to bed. The story my parents told everyone, though, was much simpler. Poor Claire, always overwhelmed, always needing help with the children, always one step away from falling apart. That version of me was useful to them because it made Walter look heroic, and Diane look long-suffering. What people didn't see was how much money I had quietly pushed into that family. When Diane's property tax bill came in short one spring, I covered it. When Megan's husband lost a contract and their mortgage payment went red, I floated them a few $1,000s they promised to return once things stabilized. When Walter's insurance deductible on a minor surgery was due, I paid it because Diane cried on the phone and said they were embarrassed to ask anyone else. When Megan's son needed braces and there was suddenly a gap in the insurance, guess who wired the money? Me. Every time. Always framed as temporary. Always treated later like it had never happened. By last Christmas, I had a spreadsheet on my laptop labeled Family Transfers because I got tired of being gaslit about what I had and hadn't done. It wasn't revenge then. It was self-defense. I logged dates, amounts, excuses, promises. I kept screenshots because Diane had a habit of saying things like, "You offered?" after she had begged for hours. The most infuriating part was that Walter genuinely believed a few hours of babysitting and a couple of handyman visits erased everything else. He loved saying things like, "Family is about showing up," when what he meant was, "Family is about people showing up for me." So when he made that announcement at Christmas dinner, it wasn't really about childcare or repairs. It was about power. He wanted an audience. He wanted Noah and Elsie to watch their mother get put in her place. He wanted Megan to laugh, Diane to stay silent, and me to smile through it the way I always had. What he didn't know was that I had stopped being willing to play that role months earlier. I just hadn't had a good enough reason to blow the whole thing open until he decided to hand me one over roasted ham and candlelight. That dinner had already been uneasy before Walter opened his mouth. Diane had insisted we all celebrate at my place because she said my studio home felt festive and intimate, which was rich, considering she hadn't contributed a single dish and showed up late carrying store-bought cookies she wanted everyone to praise like they were heirlooms. Megan arrived first with her husband, her son, and the kind of energy that fills a room without warming it. She walked through my front room, glanced at the handmade garlands Noah and Elsie had taped along the bookcases, and said, "This is cute. Crowded, but cute." I ignored her. My children were excited, wearing matching red sweaters and still young enough to think family gatherings were supposed to feel safe. Walter came in last, took one look at the noise, the wrapping paper, the kids moving between adults, and his expression hardened the way it always did when joy didn't center him. I knew that look. I had known it since I was 8 years old, and he told me, in front of half the neighborhood, that I laughed too loudly for a little girl. So when he started making under-his-breath comments about the chaos, I heard the same knife in a different room. At one point, Elsie, who was 6 and still believed most adults meant well, tugged his sleeve and asked if Grandpa wanted to see the tiny star she had glued onto a handmade place card for him. He barely looked at it. "Maybe later," he muttered. She came back to me trying to smile, and that alone took something sharp across my nerves. Then at dinner, Noah accidentally bumped a spoon. It clattered against a plate. Walter sighed theatrically, and Diane gave me that exhausted maternal look like I was somehow responsible for gravity. I should have known then he was building up to something. Still, I kept trying to hold the room together because mothers get trained to think it's our job to stop explosions even when we didn't light the fuse. I passed dishes, poured cider, checked on the roast, smiled for the kids, and told myself to get through one more holiday without giving them the spectacle they always seemed to want from me. Then Walter stood. He tapped his fork against his glass like we were about to hear a toast. Megan actually quieted her son and looked up expectantly. Walter cleared his throat and said, "I've got a Christmas announcement. Since Claire seems to think family is some kind of free service, your mother and I are done babysitting, done doing repairs, done bailing her out every time she can't manage her own house." My stomach dropped, not because his cruelty surprised me, but because of how calculated it was. He had waited until both my children were watching. He wanted them to hear that their mother was a burden. I looked around the table. Diane didn't tell him to stop. Megan pressed her lips together like she was trying not to grin. Her husband stared at his plate. Noah went still. Elsie blinked at me, confused, and in that second I was hit by a memory so sudden it felt physical. Me at 8 years old, holding a drawing I'd won a school prize for, while Walter told his friends I'd only gotten it because the judges felt sorry for sensitive kids. Same voice, same public humiliation, same need to make me smaller so he could feel bigger. And all at once, I knew I wasn't doing it anymore. I set my fork down and said, "Seriously?" Walter nodded like a judge delivering sentence. "Seriously, maybe now you'll learn how the world works." I almost laughed, because the world had been working exactly the way he liked for years. I sent money quietly, fixed messes quietly, absorbed disrespect quietly, and he still got to call me helpless in front of a crowd. I said, "You watched me cover Mom's taxes. You watched me help Megan keep her mortgage current. You called me for your deductible, Walter. Don't stand in my house and act like replacing a garbage disposal makes you my patron saint." That was the first moment the room changed. Megan jerked her head up. Diane whispered, "Claire, don't do this." Walter's face darkened. "Now you're keeping score?" he snapped. "That tells me everything I need to know." "No," I said, rising, my hands steady now. I started keeping records because all of you rewrite history. He opened his mouth again, probably to call me dramatic, but then Elsie's small voice cut through the room. Mom, did Grandpa mean he doesn't want to come anymore? I looked down at my daughter and felt the last hesitation burn off. I would not let my children learn the lesson I learned from my mother: swallow humiliation to keep family close. I pulled their coats from the hook by the door and said, clearly enough for everyone, we're leaving. And if humiliating me in front of my kids was your idea of setting boundaries, don't worry, I'll handle the rest. Walter barked something behind me about disrespect. Megan called after me that I was overreacting. Diane said, Claire, not on Christmas. But I didn't turn around. Noah carried his sister's stocking to the car. I buckled them both in, shut the doors, sat behind the wheel, and only once we were driving through the dark did I let myself shake. Noah asked, very quietly, Are we in trouble? I told him no. Not us, I said. We're just done pretending. When I finally got the kids to sleep at home, I checked my phone. A few texts from Megan. One missed call from Diane. Nothing from Walter. I thought maybe that was it. I was wrong. Because sometime after midnight, Diane went online and decided to tell her version of the story first. I woke up at 6:17 the next morning to my phone vibrating so hard on the nightstand it nearly fell to the floor. 36 missed calls, 11 voicemails, more texts than I could see on the lock screen. For one dizzy second, I thought something terrible had happened to someone physically, but then I saw most of the calls were from Diane, Megan, 2 aunts, 3 cousins, and one old family friend who had no business contacting me at all. That kind of pattern meant only one thing in my family. Somebody had already turned the narrative into a public event. I opened the messages first. Call your mother. What did you say to your father? Take down whatever you posted. How could you do this on Christmas? My heart was beating hard now, but not from fear, from recognition. I knew exactly what Diane had done before I even opened Facebook. Sure enough, there it was at the top of her page, posted at 1:12 a.m., next to a carefully cropped photo of my dining room table from earlier in the evening, before everything blew up. Candles glowing, glasses raised, children blurred in the corner. Her caption read, Some people only know how to take from family until the moment loving boundaries are set. Hardest Christmas of my life, but peace sometimes costs you a daughter's anger. Underneath were the comments. Praying for you, Diane. Boundaries matter. Grandparents aren't free labor. Some daughters don't appreciate anything. And then Megan, of course. Proud of you for finally speaking up. I stared at that line for a full 10 seconds because it was the exact moment something inside me shifted from wounded to cold. Diane had not just allowed Walter to humiliate me in front of my children. She had then gone online after midnight to turn herself into a saint. And me into a parasite. She wanted witnesses. Fine. I knew how to give her those. I didn't call first. I didn't text. I went to my laptop, opened the folder where I kept screenshots and transfers, and sat there in my robe with my coffee going cold beside me while I pulled up the numbers. Diane's property taxes, $2,143. Megan's mortgage shortfall, $1,800, then another $900 the following month. Walter's deductible, $3,275. Braces payment, furnace repair. 2 utility shutoff reversals for Diane's house, each one neatly logged, each one time-stamped, each one followed by some variation of thank you, we'll make it right. I didn't need all of them. I only needed enough to puncture the lie. So I went back to Diane's post and wrote one comment. Just one. Loving boundaries? Interesting phrase. Since we're being public, let's be accurate. In the last 2 years alone, I paid your property taxes, Dad's deductible, Megan's mortgage shortfall, Ben's braces deposit, and 2 of your overdue utility bills. Dad watched all of that happen before standing up in my house and telling my children I live off him because he babysat twice a month. If you want peace, maybe start with honesty. I attached nothing at first. I didn't need to. The power was in the calmness, the specificity. The fact that Diane knew I could back every word. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then the comment count jumped. Then my phone rang again. Diane. Declined. Megan. Declined. Walter for the first time since dinner. Declined. A cousin commented, "Wait, what?" An aunt wrote, "Diane, is this true?" Megan replied something frantic about private family help and twisting context. So I added one screenshot. Diane asking, "Can you please cover the tax bill before Friday? We're desperate." Another screenshot. Walter texting, "Insurance wants the deductible up front. Don't mention this to your mother yet." After that, the mood under the post changed completely. It was almost immediate. People who had spent hours comforting Diane went silent. Then one by one, they started asking sharper questions. Why did Claire pay your taxes if she's so dependent? You let Walter say that in front of the kids? Megan, didn't we help fundraise for your hard season too? And then the line that really flipped it came from my Aunt Joanne, my mother's older sister and one of the few people Diane still cared about impressing. Diane, if you made a liar out of all of us to protect Walter's pride, say it now. I remember reading that and feeling a calm I hadn't felt in years. Not joy, not exactly. More like standing up after carrying something too heavy and realizing the pain in your back had a shape. Diane deleted the post 7 minutes later. Too late. Screenshots were already moving through family group chats. Megan sent me a voice memo so furious she could barely speak. Walter left a voicemail calling me vicious. Diane texted, "You could have handled this privately." I almost admired the nerve of that. Public humiliation at my Christmas table was apparently private enough. But one public correction was suddenly too far. By noon, I had relatives calling not to scold me, but to ask if I was okay. Aunt Joanne asked if the kids had heard everything. My cousin Natalie said, "I always thought something was off in how your parents talked about you." Even Megan's husband texted one line, "I'm sorry." That was the first crack. Not because I suddenly felt vindicated, but because I realized the performance had depended on my silence more than I ever understood. Once I stopped protecting them, they looked exactly like what they were. What happened over the next week was not some dramatic movie montage where everyone immediately turned noble, and my parents instantly collapsed under the weight of exposure. It was messier than that, which made it more satisfying in its own way. Diane and Walter tried at first to muscle the story back under control. Diane called relatives crying, saying I had weaponized money and kept score against acts of love. Walter told anyone who would listen that I was unstable, bitter from my divorce, and trying to alienate the grandchildren. Megan went with the favorite family tactic, which was pretending the real issue was tone. According to her, it didn't matter that Walter had publicly shamed me and Diane had lied online. What mattered was that I had embarrassed them in return. But there was a problem they couldn't smooth over this time. Receipts are terrible at obeying hierarchy. Aunt Joanne called me and asked, gently but directly, how much I had actually covered over the years. I told her the truth. Then she asked if I had more screenshots. I said yes. She went quiet for a second and told me to save everything. The next day, she called Diane, and whatever happened in that conversation I never heard in full. But by evening, Diane was texting me in clipped little bursts, asking whether I was seriously trying to divide the whole family. I didn't answer. I was too busy doing something far more important, closing the access points they had taken for granted. I canceled the standing transfer I had set up to help Diane with her taxes that spring. I removed my card from the hardware account Walter still used from the days when I let him pick up materials for my place, and then quietly paid the bill because arguing seemed uglier than covering it. I stopped answering Megan's quick question texts, which almost always involved money without using the word, and I told Noah and Elsie, in the simplest language I could manage, that we wouldn't be visiting Grandpa for a while because Grandpa had forgotten how to be kind. Kids understand more than adults want to admit. Noah nodded like he already knew. Elsie asked if that meant she had done something wrong. I got down on the floor with her and said, "No, baby. Sometimes grown-ups do wrong because no one ever taught them shame." That line stayed with me all week, because the thing Walter hated most wasn't losing access to me. It was losing the image of himself as the long-suffering patriarch. Once people knew the money trail, every favor he had bragged about looked smaller. Meanwhile, the consequences started showing up in ordinary ways. Megan's husband, Ben, apparently learned how much of their temporary help had actually come from me and not from Walter and Diane as they'd implied. He called me one afternoon and sounded half embarrassed, half furious. "I didn't know," he said. "I thought my in-laws had been helping us." I told him no. It had been me. There was a long pause. Then he said, "That changes a lot." A week later, Megan messaged me that Ben had moved money into a separate account and wanted clarity on all household debts. That made me smile into my tea harder than I should probably admit. Diane's church friend stopped by her house after seeing the post-drama and apparently asked, in front of two other women, why Diane had accepted money from me while calling me dependent. Walter's old contractor friend, a man who loved lecturing younger people about accountability, found out I had paid Walter's deductible and then told him, "You don't get to crow about pride when your daughter's covering your medical bills." That one got back to me through a cousin, and I laughed for the first time in days. But the most important shift was internal. I stopped waiting for their version of me to soften. I stopped imagining some conversation where Walter would suddenly understand the cost of what he'd done. Instead, I started making clean decisions. When Diane texted, "The children shouldn't be dragged into adult conflict," I replied once. "Then you shouldn't have dragged them into your public humiliation of their mother." When Walter left a voicemail saying, "You owe me respect whether you like me or not," I deleted it without listening a second time. And when Megan asked if we could meet as sisters and calm this down, I realized what she actually meant was, "Can you please resume your old role so the rest of us can stop feeling consequences?" The answer was no. Not loudly, not theatrically, just no. In those same days, I began assembling something I should have built long ago: distance with structure. I blocked Walter on social media. I moved Diane and Megan to a muted folder. I changed the lock code on my front door because Walter still had a bad habit of dropping by to check things. I let my children's school know that no pickups or surprise visits from grandparents were authorized. That wasn't revenge. That was finally taking my own safety seriously. The more I did it, the clearer everything became. This had never been one ugly Christmas. It was a long pattern, and Christmas had simply handed me the public proof I needed to stop excusing it. And the thing about abusive family systems is that once one person stops lying on their behalf, everyone has to decide whether they're going to face the truth or attack the mirror. Walter chose attack. That was his mistake, because by the time he asked to meet me face to face like adults, the rest of the family had already started seeing him with his mask off. Walter wanted the meeting at a diner off Route 1, the kind of place older men pick when they think neutral ground makes them sound reasonable. I almost didn't go, but Aunt Joanne told me something that stayed with me. Sometimes you need to hear a person unchanged one last time before you stop hoping. So I went. I wore jeans, boots, and the coat Noah said made me look like someone in charge, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. Walter was already in the booth when I arrived. Coffee in front of him, jaw set, face redder than usual. Diane was there too, though she had implied he wanted to talk alone. That should have warned me. Megan came 5 minutes later, sliding in beside Diane like this was an intervention. No apology in sight, no softness, just control, repackaged as family concern. I sat down, kept my coat on, and said, "You have 10 minutes. Walter started with the voice men use when they think volume equals authority. "You went too far," he said. "Whatever problems we had, you don't shame your family in public." I almost smiled. "You stood up at my Christmas table and called me a burden in front of my children." He waved that away. I was setting boundaries. "No," I said. "You were performing." Diane jumped in then, saying they had only wanted me to appreciate how much they had carried for me over the years. Megan added that everyone was exhausted by my resentment ledger, which was a rich phrase coming from someone whose husband had only just discovered how much of their mortgage I had covered. I listened, really listened, and realized something extraordinary. Not one of them had come to take responsibility. They had come because the public narrative failed and they wanted me back in the role of silent absorber. Walter finally leaned forward and dropped the mask entirely. "You embarrassed me," he said, in front of Joanne, in front of old friends, in front of Megan's husband. "You made me look like I lived off my daughter." I held his gaze. "Because you did." That was when his face changed. Any possibility of a civil conversation evaporated. "After all I've done," he snapped. "After every repair, every hour with your kids, every Christmas, every time I showed up, you think you can erase me because I told the truth? You can't raise children right, Claire. You're soft. You let them run wild. I said what needed to be said, and if I had to do it again, I would." Diane whispered, "Walter." But it wasn't moral outrage. It was fear he was saying the quiet part too clearly. Megan tried a softer version of the same poison. "Maybe Dad handled it badly," she said, "but he's not wrong that you depend on people and then resent them." I looked at her and, for maybe the first time in our lives, said exactly what I meant. "You've been taking money from me for 2 years while letting Mom tell people I'm barely scraping by. Don't confuse my silence with dependence." The booth went very still. Walter laughed then, a short, ugly sound. "There it is," he said. "You always were your mother's daughter. Keep score, hold grudges, make every kindness transactional." That sentence would have gutted me years earlier. Instead, I felt only clarity, because kindness was not what he had offered. Control dressed up as sacrifice was not kindness. Public humiliation was not truth. So I stood up. Walter looked almost startled, as if he genuinely believed he still had enough power to keep me seated. I laid cash on the table for my untouched coffee and said, "You don't get to see Noah and Elsie anymore, not until they're old enough to choose for themselves and strong enough to know what emotional cruelty looks like. You don't get to drop by my house, call my phone, or ask other people to carry messages for you. And since you care so much about what family means, here's the lesson. Family is not an audience for your ego." Diane's face went white. Megan actually said, "You can't do that." "Gay." I turned to her and said, "Watch me." Then I left Walter sitting in that booth with his hands flat on the table and, for the first time I had ever seen, no language that still worked. Later that night, Ben called to tell me Megan had come home furious, and Walter had followed them back to the house, ranting about entitlement, only for Ben to tell him on the porch, in front of the kids, that he wasn't welcome there until he learned the difference between help and domination. That detail mattered to me more than I expected. Not because I needed men to validate my experience, but because men like Walter depend on the silence of other men more than anyone admits. From there, the collapse got quieter and harsher. Diane stopped being invited to host extended family lunches because nobody trusted her version of events. Megan's social media got noticeably emptier of family content because she couldn't post beautiful holiday traditions without people remembering what had actually happened. Walter, the man who loved being consulted, stopped getting calls about home projects and opinions and practical advice. That kind of exile is small on paper and devastating in reality. Still, he didn't apologize. He told people I was poisoning the family against him. He said I was keeping the grandchildren from him out of spite. He told Diane I would come around because she always does. He was wrong. And a little over 3 months later, on a gray March afternoon, I got a phone call that proved just how wrong. The call came from a hospital in Cranston. Walter had suffered what the nurse described as a serious but survivable stroke. And because Diane had listed me as an emergency contact years earlier and apparently never updated anything, my name was still in the system. I stood in my studio with a half-repaired atlas open under my hands, glue drying at the spine, and listened while the nurse explained rehab, observation, family notification. I thanked her, told her Diane should be the primary contact, and hung up. Then I stood there for a long minute, not moving, because no matter how done you are, there are some calls your body still receives like old weather. Megan texted immediately after. Dad had a stroke. Please don't make this harder. Not, please come. Not, please forgive. Just the usual request that I help smooth over discomfort. I asked Aunt Joanne for the truth. She called and told me Diane had been at the hospital. Megan came and went. But Walter had asked for me twice. Asked was probably too generous, Joanne said. Demanded, then cried. I sat on the floor of my workroom after that and looked at the grain in the old wood boards while Noah and Elsie colored at the back table, safe, unaware of the old war trying one more time to pull at me. This is the part where stories usually force a clean moral lesson. Daughter hears father is weak. Daughter remembers he's human. Daughter rushes in. Daughter forgives. I need you to know that real life did not do that for me. What I felt was not revenge, exactly. It was the weight of every time I had abandoned myself so someone else could keep their role intact. I thought about Walter standing at my Christmas table. I thought about Elsie asking if Grandpa didn't want to come anymore. I thought about Diane posting that lie after midnight while I slept one room away from my children, exhausted and shaking. And I thought about the diner, Walter saying if he had to do it again, he would. That sentence mattered, because people love to romanticize sickness as if frailty automatically creates remorse. It doesn't. Sometimes it only removes the performance and leaves the same person asking for access without accountability. 2 days later, after arranging childcare, I drove to the hospital. Not because I had changed my mind, because I wanted to be certain mine was made in daylight. Not from fear or guilt or a cousin's opinion about what good daughters do. Walter was in ICU step-down by then, gray-faced, smaller, one side of his mouth altered, the machinery around him making everything feel both tragic and oddly impersonal. Diane saw me through the window and stood so quickly I thought she might faint. Her eyes filled immediately. "Claire," she said, like my name itself should finish the rest. I asked one question. "Did he apologize?" Diane looked stricken, which was answer enough. "He wants to see the kids," she whispered. "No," I said. She started crying then, telling me life was short, families regret things. Walter was scared. Walter didn't mean so much of what he'd said. I listened. Then I told her something I had learned the hard way. Fear of consequences is not the same thing as regret for harm. Diane covered her mouth. I almost pitied her in that moment. She had spent a lifetime building her marriage around making Walter's emotional weather everybody else's problem, and now even catastrophe couldn't buy back what his pride had cost him. I walked to the glass and looked at him. He was awake. His eyes found me. Even then, even weak and attached to tubes, I saw anger before shame. He lifted one hand slightly, beckoning. I didn't move. I stood there long enough to know he had seen me clearly, long enough for him to understand this was a choice, not an accident. And then I turned around. Diane said my name once, sharp with disbelief. Megan stared at me like I had just broken some sacred rule. Maybe I had. Maybe the sacred rule in our family had always been that Claire absorbs, Claire explains, Claire returns. Not anymore. I walked out of the hospital, got in my car, and cried so hard I had to wait 10 minutes before I could drive. Not because I thought I'd made the wrong decision, because sometimes the right decision is still grief. In the months after that, things settled into a new shape. Walter moved into rehab, then into a smaller assisted living arrangement because Diane couldn't manage him alone, and no one volunteered to step into the old orbit again. Megan kept contact with them, but more cautiously now, because Ben had made it clear there would be no more hidden debts, no more rewriting family history in his house. Aunt Joanne stayed close to me. Noah and Elsie stopped asking about Grandpa. Kids do that when adults stop making instability their climate. As for me, I kept working, kept restoring broken books, which felt fitting somehow. Some things can be repaired if the binding is honest and the damage is named. Some things can only be preserved as evidence of what they survived. Last Christmas, 1 year after the dinner that cracked everything open, Noah helped me string lights across the studio doorway while Elsie stamped little gold stars onto handmade gift tags. There was no speech, no performance, no one tapping a glass to make me small. Just peace, real peace. The kind my mother tried to fake in that midnight post and never understood. And if you're wondering whether I regret walking away from that hospital room, the answer is no. I regret that I ever believed love required me to stand still while someone humiliated me. I regret that my children ever had to watch me try. But walking away? No. I chose my children. I chose the version of myself they deserve to learn from. So I'll leave you with the question Walter forced me to answer for myself. If the person who hurt you most was finally weak enough to need you, but still not honest enough to own what they did, would you walk in, or would you walk away?
In my opinion, this story is powerful because it shows that protecting your peace is not cruelty, it is courage. Claire didn't choose revenge out of bitterness alone. She chose to stop a cycle of humiliation and emotional control before it reached her children. Sometimes the strongest response is simply refusing to be used anymore. What about you? If you were in Claire's place, would you have walked away from that hospital room or given her father one last chance?